Silent Bob!
Hello and welcome to another edition of Film Seizure at the Movies. I am Geoff Arbuckle, and I'm going to talk about Kevin Smith and his new movie, Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. But before I get to that, let me do a little bit of the housekeeping stuff. New episodes of Film Seizure are every Wednesday morning on filmseizure.com. On Monday afternoons, you can catch my newest episode of Monster Mondays, also on filmseizure.com. You can catch everything that Film Seizure does through iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and Spotify. I even upload the stuff to YouTube if that's your preference there. Also, every Friday morning, you can read my review / live blog, whatever you want to call it, of B-Movie at bmovieanima.com. Saw the latest View Askew universe movie, Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. This was released through Fathom Events. And what's interesting, what I'm kind of glad I ended up doing was I ended up getting tickets for the second night of the release, which the first night came with a movie poster. The second night came with a double feature with Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. This is more or less a direct sequel to that, while also fitting into the larger View Askew universe. So it's, and I'm kind of glad I got to see it because, you know, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back played first and then went into Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. So a lot of things that were pretty dependent on seeing Strike Back is you got to see it before you saw Reboot. And I'm thankful for that because I admit it's been a few years since I've watched any of Kevin Smith's movies. So I think it's probably best to start with talking about Kevin Smith. Being a person from Generation X, Kevin Smith is a bit of an idol for a lot of the disaffected youth of Generation X, a lot of the sensibilities of Generation X, particularly from kind of small town / 80s, 90s type of people. Kevin Smith was kind of a big influence to our worlds, and his first movie, Clerks, came out in 1994, and I didn't really even realize until right before until earlier in the day before seeing the movie that, wow, it's been 25 years. And so this is kind of a 25th anniversary kind of celebration of Clerks and of the whole View Askew productions. And I saw, when I graduated high school in 1995, I started working at a video store, and I saw within my first week of being there, a guy that I used to work with by the name of Chris. He said, well, if you're going to work here, you probably should see this movie. And he's like, take home Clerks, watch it. It's going to be it's going to speak to you, particularly in this job. And, you see a movie like that, and it's this really low budget, seemingly highbrow movie with kind of some lowbrow jokes and so forth. And it was a little bit, not to kind of oversell this, it was a little bit life-changing. Pardon me. And it was it was something that made you feel a little bit more grown up. It was not Naked Gun or Wayne's World or the other movies from the earlier 90s that I kind of grew up with. It was something a little bit more seemingly intelligent in the way that it was built. And it was this kind of happened during this kind of independent Hollywood era. And so it kind of seemed smart, and it was, it was really fun if you'd ever really worked in the service, particularly in a retail sense, or at least a retail sense in not like your department store, but your convenience shops, your video store places. It really kind of spoke to you, and and it really spoke to me because, after high school, I didn't go right to college. I didn't really do things like that, and in a way, I've always kind of embraced my slackerdom of this, just kind of floating by on life, particularly through my 20s. And so Kevin Smith's movies really kind of spoke to me. Well, his follow-up movie, Mallrats, was a little bit more cartoonish in its comedy, and of course, Clerks ultimately ended up having a cartoon series very briefly, right around 2000 or so, but 1999, 2000, somewhere along there. But Mallrats was much more cartoonish, but still kind of brought in some of that comic book influence that Kevin Smith had, which of course I grew up on. So it had a different feel, but it was still very something that that people of a certain age, of a certain background, of a certain sensibility would really kind of appreciate. Then came what I will always say is his best movie, which is Chasing Amy. And, set aside what people would say about it today in the 21st century in 2019, that Chasing Amy is yes, if Chasing Amy came out today as it did in 97 or 8 or whenever that came out, yeah, I could see where people would say that there are some problematic themes in it. There's some problematic ideas, particularly coming from the perspective of a straight male's character falling in love with a lesbian character, and the lesbian character seemingly going for it almost as if her sexuality is kind of just something to be experimented with when you're already an adult. That's there's problems there. I admit that. But in the late 90s, it was something a little bit different. And while it's it's hard to really kind of defend it, but I think it's just kind of one of those things where it's like, in some ways, to me at least, it kind of opened my eyes. Not that, oh wow, I mean, I can change the lesbian's sexual preference by just loving her. No, nothing like that. Nothing like what some of the criticism that movie takes on. But it does kind of open. It's kind of there meant to kind of say, hey, you know what? There are different types of people who do different types of things, and then that's the way I looked at it as a very young, early 20s guy who hadn't really ever had much exposure to stuff like that, to people, to different types of people, different types of ways of life, and so on. So, yes, in 2019, Chasing Amy's not exactly appropriate, but in 1997 or 8, it's a little bit. It's a different time. It was a different type of thing, and that's. It's still, I think there are still some very, very good scenes and some very, very good moments and some very heartfelt moments in that movie. And so the reason why I wanted to talk about kind of Kevin Smith's whole history is that to kind of frame this in the way that I felt when I was watching Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, and then follow that up with Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. Kevin Smith's first 3 movies to me are almost not to put too much emphasis on this, but in a lot of ways I kind of look at it like, they're almost sacred, almost like the original Star Wars trilogy, right? It's, they're 3 movies that I watched at a particular time in my life that meant something to me, that meant well, in some ways it influenced me. In some ways it It's comfortable to watch those movies. It takes me back to a time that I, in a lot of ways, I miss. But at the same time, I was there. I was an adult during those times that those things came out, and it kind of helps frame a lot of my sensibilities and a lot of my where I was back then in the late 90s. Dogma was his next movie, and while some people will say Dogma is his best movie, it's certainly one of his biggest idea movies. But while it's certainly personal to him, to Kevin Smith, because he is Catholic, he was raised Catholic, he's got things to say about Catholicism. It didn't really land for me, but I have friends who were raised Catholic who find the movie very funny or very well made or very interesting in their own rights, and that's fine. It's not really. It just not that it isn't good to me. It's just it doesn't quite pull at the same strings that the first three movies did. So by the time that 2001 came around, I was still in my early to mid 20s. I was 24 when Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back came out. And I got to see it a little early because I worked at a movie theater by then. And it was this really, really broad comedy with these very cartoonish characters. And it's a movie about a couple of dumb guys who are misinterpreting something that's being said about them, that's being done with their likenesses and with their names. And it's this funny road comedy, and and really at the end of that movie, there's a little coda at the end of the credits where you have Alanis Morissette, who played God in Dogma, kind of closing the book on the View Askew universe. And it's at the time, you think, wow, yeah, if this is where it ends, if this is where it goes, I'm happy. I'm fine with this. However, and we'll get back around to Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back because it's really kind of important for Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. But in that same year, in that same summer that I saw Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, I went with a friend to a comic book convention in Chicago, and he and I got to meet Kevin Smith. And Kevin Smith is an incredibly nice guy. He's just one of us. It's like he gets to make movies, the movies he wants to make, the movies he wants to watch himself. But he's really a very, very nice guy. And a few years later, that same friend and I got to see him speak at one of his live kind of talking tour shows where he goes on for hours and hours and hours, and just telling stories and talking to people and talking about his experiences. And he is an incredibly, he's super charismatic. He's a hell of a storyteller. He is, he's like hanging out with one of your buds and just shooting the shit with him. And I will always appreciate how kind he was to every one of his fans at that convention. This was back in a day where you didn't have to pay to see somebody at a convention. If they were the guest of honor and you have the time to stand in line to see them, you got to get something signed, and they even took a picture with you. And that was exactly how Kevin Smith was. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Kevin Smith is still that way. I don't think he accepts situations where he gets paid or an exchange of money happens to get his signature or to have a moment of his time, which is really something, because that's something that's definitely changed in fan culture that I personally don't care much for. But, we stood in line for an hour and a half or whatever. I had a little poster of Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back from working at the movie theater and getting to see the movie early. It was left over from the promotional screening that was going on. And, and I got to tell him that I'd already seen it, and his eyes lit up, and he was so excited to hear what I thought of it. Because at this point in time, it was just playing at certain special engagements or those types of things where you get a special ticket through through a comic book store or radio station or something like that. So he was really excited to hear what I had to say, and he gave me the time to talk to him about it. And then after all of that, I got to go behind the table, sit next to him, and take a picture with him. A picture I still have today with that poster signed, framed still in my comic book room. Which is it's one of those things that you don't forget things like that, and he ingratiates himself so much to his fans that even when he does misfires, you don't throw him away. That said, beyond those first 5 View Askew movies, I hadn't seen much of his other movies. I did see Jersey Girl. It wasn't particularly great. It's not even memorable, honestly. I hadn't seen his other movies, the Zack and Miri, Tusk, or Yoga Hosers, or that... it was a Cop Out, I think, was with Bruce Willis. I hadn't seen those movies. By all accounts, those movies aren't particularly... a lot of those movies have hits and misses. Yoga Hosers, his last movie starring his daughter, Harley Quinn Smith, is, by all accounts, almost unwatchable. And I wanted to bring that up because that does kind of... play into my upcoming review here of Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. But when Clerks 2 came along in 2006, one thing that I really kind of liked about it was that while it did still have its connections to the View Askew universe, there was something that I think Kevin Smith was trying to say, which was, here are these guys that were in their 20s in the first movie, kind of aimless in life, and now they're in their 30s and still aimless. They still don't seem to have any kind of direction. They don't seem to have any kind of they're stuck. They're stuck in a time and place that is kind of passed them by. And when I saw that, I was about to turn 30. I had just gotten out of working kind of low pay, kind of dead end type jobs. And so I could really kind of relate to that. It's like, wow, it's like, whew, at a certain point in every person's life, they kind of have to take the bull by the horns and say, okay, is this what I'm going to be for the rest of my life? Or do I try to improve, go to a new, get a new job, get a new direction, or whatever. That happens to everybody. And there were moments in Clerks 2 that was not just satisfying, but there were also times that were kind of sad. You see these people kind of stuck in this rut, and then you look at yourself, and particularly from a Generation X standpoint, where we were always kind of checked out. And so it's in a lot of ways, Clerks 2, what it was trying to say, what it was trying to do, was very effective to a lot of people, particularly me. Now, while there are some things about Clerks 2 that are a little bit uneven, I really, really appreciated that this was kind of separate from the View Askew universe. It was kind of trying to tell a story with familiar characters that was done in a slightly different way than a lot of his previous movies had been done. So in a way, it was kind of even Kevin Smith maybe saying, I've got to change my direction too. I need to go kind of in a different trajectory. I can't just rely on the same old stuff that I had done before. That ultimately leads into a dead end. So that brings us to, here I've gone almost 20 minutes and I haven't even talked about Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. So that takes us right to Jay and Silent Bob Reboot. And here's the thing about this movie. It has things that it wants to say. It has things it wants to accomplish with the script about basically painting kind of a broad comedy that pokes fun at sequels, remakes, and reboots while being all three of those things at the same time, which is really clever in some regards. The main issue, though, that I have with this movie kind of happens with some of the characters. So in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, of course, Jay and Silent Bob find out that there's a Blunt Man and Chronic movie being made, and people are talking shit about them online, which is, almost kind of, it was kind of, in 2001, you didn't think about chat rooms or comment sections like you do today, 18 years later. But yeah, I mean, comment sections, chat rooms, forums, all of those were always places for people to express dumb opinions, to hide behind the mask of anonymity, and to sound like you're an expert in something that you probably aren't, or you're probably very close-minded in. And so you got all of this stuff, and they were trying to strike back against the world, try to stop this movie so these people would stop talking about them. Once they're unable to stop that, basically then they decide to go out and beat the shit out of everybody who made negative comments about them, which is, that's a broad comedy. I mean, it's a road movie. It's kind of a zany. It goes beyond cartoonish in a lot of places. But in the movie, they meet these 4 cat burglar girls, played by Kevin Smith's wife, Jennifer, is it Schwalbach, I think, Ali Larder, Eliza Dushku, and most importantly, Shannon Elizabeth. And Jay and Justice, who's played by Shannon Elizabeth, fall in love with one another. Well, the movie kind of ends with her going to jail, and Jay and Silent Bob just kind of, they're rich from kind of cashing in on the Blunt Man and Chronic movie, because it's their likenesses that the comic that the movie was based on always followed, and so on. Well, in Jay and Silent Bob Reboot, it starts with them finding out that there's going to be a rebooted movie for Blunt Man and Chronic. And they learned from Jason Lee's character from Mallrats that essentially what a reboot is and what it is compared to a remake, which, they make this joke a few times, where a reboot is something that is, you take everything that you take an original property, you switch out some things that didn't quite work, you turn up the stuff that did work out, and then you replace characters with something younger and more diverse. And it's a formula. I mean, it's 100%. Kevin Smith is saying this is the formula that Hollywood uses for reboots, and it's true. You take what you like about something that you can make money off of, and then you just make it younger and more diverse, and boom, repackage it and send it out. And so that really plays out because Jay and Silent Bob ultimately discover that Justice is now living in Chicago. Jay wants to go and reconnect with his long-lost girlfriend. Come to find out that 2 things. One, Jay is such a fuck up that he never visited Justice in jail, leading her to believe that he was upset with her for going to jail for being a diamond thief, or just being generally just generally moving on from her, or just kind of throwing her away. And that is just kind of plays to how much of an idiot the Jay and Silent Bob characters are, that all of this grand adventure that happened in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back means absolutely nothing to at least to Jay. And so he is then told that, well, they do have a love child, and the love child is played by Harley Quinn Smith, and she kind of represents this group of 4 girls that are kind of similar to the diamond thieves of Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, but they're younger and they're more diverse. There's Justice, who's a young white girl. You have her friend is a deaf black girl. You have an Asian girl, and you have a Muslim girl. And so, yeah, it's playing up that joke of being younger and more diverse, being these exact same things. Jay and Silent Bob are on a road trip with these 4 female characters again, and they don't get along. And there is an intelligence to that joke, and there are some very, very funny moments in this movie. And I'll get to my main complaint here in just a minute with this movie, but this movie works in a couple of ways and doesn't work in a couple of ways. The first thing is that any time that the older View Askew characters are on screen or interacting with Jay and Silent Bob, it's really, really nice, and it's really, really it brings me back to those earlier movies that I spent most of this review talking about. There is a few interactions that are just flat out heartwarming. Seeing Jason Lee as Brody again is always fun. It's always great. It's his interaction with Jay and Silent Bob as that character is takes me right back to Mallrats. It takes me right back to those earlier movies. And there's a really nice tribute paid to Stan Lee in a couple of moments in this movie that is that's really nice just from a comic book fan standpoint. And since Stan Lee was in Mallrats, it's great that they're able to play those to have those moments to kind of stop and appreciate this person that meant so much to Kevin Smith. So anytime where Jay and Silent Bob are kind of interacting with those original characters, it's great. It's really it takes me back to those original movies. On the other hand, there's a big problem with this movie, and that's with the new characters. And while yes, I understand that the joke is that these characters are younger, they're kind of turning up the clash, particularly because this isn't just a Gen X and millennial story; it's a Gen X and Gen Z story. So there's a even larger generational gap. And while that's kind of interesting, Kevin Smith isn't. If I had one criticism to make, Kevin Smith is really not very good at writing for younger audiences. He is very much of his time. He's very much a Gen X person. He makes movies for Gen X people. He's not very good at telling stories for other generations. And this movie has about an hour of, it's about half this movie, 45 minutes to almost an hour of this movie is spent really, really disliking a set of characters that are supposedly very important to this movie. And that's the younger version of the 4 women that kind of reboot the 4 women characters from Strike Back. And man, they are just so unlikable that it's at times kind of painful. And it's a lot of that time is just Harley Quinn Smith's character Millie just being just an asshole. And like, I understand being a little dead set on what your plan is. I understand what's trying to be said there. I understand that there is a conversationally, there's a gap between generations. I understand that. But where this movie ultimately goes to try to basically bring Jay and Millie together, it's a real hard road. And while, yeah, you could say, well, that's kind of part of the point, it's also it's also not a good idea to make her almost so completely and totally unlikable that you can't stand to be with that character. And that's my number one complaint with this movie, that these younger characters, if it were me, I'd dump their asses on the side of the road and keep going to Hollywood. To hell with them. They're so unlikable. They're so ungrateful. They're so they're just wouldn't be worth me being around them and having to deal with their shit. Even though if one of them was my daughter, I'd still say, you know what? She's an ungrateful little bitch. I'm dumping her. But whatever. And she does make a turn in the third act that then the movie really kind of starts picking up the real gist of what Kevin Smith is trying to say with this movie. There comes a point where you meet back up with Ben Affleck's character, Holden McNeil, who was from Chasing Amy. And you see a conclusion with his character and Joey Lauren Adams, where he helps her and her partner have a child. And, he kind of shares parenting with them. And it's this really, really, really beautiful scene in which Ben Affleck is talking about the child becoming a reboot of his life. And he puts it contextually in a way that finally allows Jay to kind of grow up and accept his role as Millie's father. And it's a really well-written scene. It's this really kind of heartwarming scene. And it kind of closes the book on those two characters from Chasing Amy. That is just really, really it's a really nice moment, and it's a really well written moment, and it really can kind of contextualizes the whole thing of what Kevin Smith is trying to say, and it brings back around that idea of what a reboot is and how it can be seen as a good thing, as in with parenthood. And so it's this really nice scene, and from there the relationship between Jay and his daughter Millie take this new trajectory that actually works in the end. And there's this really nice scene with the two of them at the very end where he begins recounting the things that happened over the past 25 years, which is the View Askew movies, where he's telling the stories that took place in Kevin Smith's movies. So the movie does kind of stick the landing. The problem is that you have to kind of wade through the unlikableness of these four young characters to get you get some good stuff at the beginning. You have to wade through that stuff with them being unlikable to get to the good stuff at the end, and some of that's going to wear real thin with people, and it was wearing thin with me. So in the end, absolutely glad to see these characters back on screen, but it's a real big mixed bag. I appreciate the characters. I appreciate Kevin Smith's dedication to these characters, his ability to kind of see these characters kind of grow up and for us to grow up with them. But at the end of the day, while some of his movies can be a bit of a mixed bag, I mean, I'll admit that even Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back is a bit of a mixed bag. But it's, in a way, I'm kind of okay if no more if no more movies are made with these characters. Just, we got the opportunity to close the book multiple times now, and so let's, it's okay for us to kind of grow up and move on. I know that Clerks 3 has been announced. And I know that Kevin Smith is kind of going back to this, partially because I think, he had a heart attack a year or two ago, and, he had a real scare that he might not survive. It led to him losing a lot of weight. But at the same time, I kind of want to see this fade off into the sunset now, because I did have moments watching this movie where I was kind of sad, and thinking about, wow, that's so many years ago now. We're all older. We're not the same people that we were when this all began, for better or worse. And and even seeing Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes introducing the movie before it started, and you see that they do look older. They've got kind of the gaunt look that a lot of people get when they get older. It's not the 90s anymore. And it's like, that was when I was kind of at my quote unquote prime, I guess. But it's not that time anymore. And maybe it's time to move on to something new. Still, if you're a fan of Kevin Smith, I definitely still would recommend seeing it, because you're probably going to see it anyway. But just be warned that there are segments of this movie that are not, that you may not like as much as others. I did see it with a bunch of other fans of Kevin Smith movies. They seem to enjoy the movie quite a bit, which I think, he's very good at making movies for his fans, and you can't really blame him for that. But I've kind of gone on a little bit longer than I intended to with this, but all of it just to say that essentially this is a pretty big mixed bag. Certainly check it out. It's nothing wrong with checking it out, but be careful that there are some characters and moments in this movie where you're just like, just leave these people behind. But anyway, so thank you to Kevin Smith for continuing with these characters, but I kind of feel like this was my opportunity to say, you know what, it's time for me to grow up too, and say, what we had in the past was great, but it's maybe time for something new. All right, so Wednesdays, filmseizure.com. Check out new episodes of Film Seizure. Mondays, also at filmseizure.com. You can check out new episodes of Monster Mondays. Every Friday, go over to bmovieanima.com to check out what I have to say about, and I, with quotation marks, it's not, let's see what I have to say about bad and lower rent movies. It's a good time. Tell some jokes, riff on some movies. It's a good time. Anyway, you can do that. You can also catch the episodes of Film Seizure and Monster Mondays at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and Spotify. But the next movie I'm going to talk about for Film Seizure at the Movies is going to be next week with Dolomite Is My Name. And until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.
And who's directing this shit anyway? Kevin fucking Smith?